What is the Panama Canal and how is it relevant to the rest of the world?
So the Panama Canal is obviously it's located in Panama in Central America. It's it's like a waterway that a lot of trade ships and even like regular people use to pass through like the Americas. So before the Panama Canal existed, if you wanted to get something, let's say from like Hawaii to like New York, you would have to, like in theory, you would have had to take your boat down all the way to like the tip of Argentina, all the way down where sort of like South America ends, and then go back up the coast. And obviously that's extremely timely and costly and super dangerous too. The waters down there are crazy. So for a long time, people knew that like a canal, like a waterway, would have to be made somewhere to sort of facilitate that trade, like being a lot easier. So Panama, between its sort of closest points on the Caribbean side and the Pacific side, are only like 50 miles long. And in the late 1800s, the French were actually the first people on paper to go in and start digging out a canal. They wanted to sort of have this waterway to own for themselves, because when you sort of are in control of something like that, when you're in control of trade between continents, if you, depending on how you tax it and stuff like that, like tariffs, it's extremely profitable for you. So they wanted to be the first, but they failed. And then in 1903, Panama got independence from Colombia because the U.S. helped them out. And then as soon as Panama got independence, the U.S. picked up where the French like sort of stopped, and they took like 10 years to build the canal with, Panamanians, like Afro-Caribbeans. They brought in like slaves, like all that sort of stuff. So in the sort of early 1900s, I'm not sure the exact year, but, probably in the 1910s, the canal started to function and the US were in control of it. So they controlled the 50-mile stretch that connected North and South America, basically. And 10 miles on either side of the canal was American territory, where they would put like military bases and stuff like that, because it's where like the Southern Command is for like the US military, and it's like a super strategic point for like intelligence and also for sort of like military bases and stuff like that. So the canal, like that's sort of how it was birthed. And Panama was just like a very convenient location. But as soon as it was built and the US had like a stake in the nation, they poured a lot of their own resources in there. A lot of Americans moved down, and Panama, like it never officially, it's sort of like a Puerto Rico type vibe to it, but it sort of acts as like a 51st state. You know what I mean? So the American interest is super high. Presidents that were put into place were like always US friendly, things of that nature. And then the canal just, more supply chains started pouring through it. And then by time the like first like true real dictatorship of Panama sort of came into play in 1968, it was sort of just like growing and growing and growing. And then, and then the dictatorship came along in 68 because Panamanians were essentially like, we're sick of America like owning our greatest assets. So I hope that explains your question a little bit of like what it is and why it's important to like the nation of Panama. Just like it really comes down to it, for the longest time, it's come down to control of the region, money, because it's just so profitable. I think 5-7% of the world's trade passes through the Panama Canal. So It's like, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's fascinating seeing how these different locations in far-flung places of the globe can impact it so greatly. I mean, you look at the blood and treasure shed trying to occupy places like Gibraltar for the British Empire, or Cape Town in South Africa, or the fights and battles over the Suez Canal or Singapore. These trading ports and junctions are crucial for the world's development. And I look at the Panama Canal and the creation of that and I go, this makes complete sense here for Americans. But what doesn't make sense is the fact that they were able to actually park up and set up shop there when this is the Panama Canal. How were the Americans able to do that?
Well, they just like had a ton of leverage. Like 1903, Panama wants independence from Colombia. Like the more indigenous people of Panama recognized that they should have their own nation. And so the US backs them in their coup, essentially, so that they can, push back against the Colombian government and take the land that was there. So the US gave them like weapons, money, even like US soldiers fought in that war. I'm not even sure what it was called, but November 3rd, 1903, Panama gets independence, and the US is sort of like, congratulations. Now, what are you going to do for us? And it wasn't so much a question. It was more so just like, we helped you. Like, now you got to help us. Like, we want this canal. We want control of it. We're going to start digging it out, and we're going to own this. And the Panamanian government sort of didn't have a leg to stand on. Like, it wasn't even a government at that stage. Like, it was essentially just rebels that overthrew like their oppressors. And so the US just took advantage of that. Obviously, that's pretty obvious, like why they would want to. And then just over the years, they just poured more and more resources into that. And then, after World War II is when the canal became like really important. Not a lot of people know this, but the Japanese actually wanted to bomb the Panama Canal instead of Pearl Harbor.
What?
And yeah, because it was so important to the US military. Like, just think about how much like supply chain and materials like would pass from Central and South America through the Panama Canal to places like Texas and Florida, like through the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean.
Gulf of America now.
No. I stand with the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of America is so stupid. So I was reading into this and actually met with a journalist in Panama about this story. They're like, the Japanese were super into it. They sent like spies to the Panama Canal, like Japanese guys pretending to be like engineers and stuff like that, but they were like checking out for sort of like strategic points of weakness. And they had this whole plan to have these like submarines and these boats transport like float bombers. So they were like those airplanes that could land on water, like, those ones, and they would drop bombs in the Panama Canal, and their goal was to like shut down the waterway for like 2 or 3 months. And that was like the beginning of like their attack on America. So when America wanted to sort of fight back, they would be, I don't know, they would have a harder time, like sort of getting their like boats from South America, or getting materials up to like build weapons, like whatever that sort of military industrial complex relied upon the Panama Canal for. They wanted to stop that, but they couldn't do it because it was just too far away, and Pearl Harbor was like sort of their second choice. So the Panama Canal has been like super important to the US since like the 1940s, obviously prior to that too, but during World War II and after World War II, just the economy got better, got bigger. People were like outsourcing more materials from like third world nations in different continents, and a lot of that stuff passed through the Panama Canal.
Globalization really takes hold.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just as the years pass, like people were spending more money, like there were more materials passed through the Panama Canal. And then by the like late 60s, when the first dictatorship under Omar Torrijos started, the Panama Canal was like booming, but the dictatorship sort of got into that position because he wanted like a Panama first kind of initiative. So he wanted the canal to be taken back into Panama's hands and out of the hands of the US, because I kind of call the whole history of Panama and like this whole thing, you could sort of describe Panama as like a third world country with a golden crown. And the golden crown is like the Panama Canal. And then as the years progressed, it became like the banking system too. But the Panama Canal is really like, it's like the heartbeat of like the whole country. It's so important to them, but it's also super important to the US as well.
So to set the scene here, the dictatorship starts in 1968.
So their first sort of like true dictator was this guy Omar Torrijos. It was 68 was the first like coup d'etat, but then 1969 was when he really like came into power. Because the first coup was it was done by the National Guard, and there were two sort of successors from that. This guy Boris Martinez, who was like America friendly, and Omar Torrijos, who was like a socialist. And the CIA backed Boris Martinez, and they sort of tried their best to like keep Torrijos out of the picture. But Manuel Noriega, who ultimately became like the dictator in the 80s, who was sort of like a true focal point of the book that I wrote, he became like the chief of intelligence for Torrijos, and he helped Torrijos sort of like squeeze out Boris Martinez and get into power. So Panama became like a socialist dictatorship in 1969.
Well, talk to me about that. I really want us to delve into socialism and the rise of it in the 20th century, because this is a pretty unseen phenomenon up until this date. So there's been Karl Marx, obviously, and his ideologies and Marxism that hasn't properly cottoned on or been implemented into a significant system until the 20th century. Suddenly you get this explosion in different attempts at creating this communist socialist utopia. So you get the Russian Revolution in 1917, and you get the overthrow of the Tsar and the murder of the entire royal family pretty much in a basement. And from that you get the USSR eventually being formed. You also have Mao's communist China that takes hold from 1949. So we've got all of these different socialist states that are major players in the global economy, and especially in the global warfare side of things in terms of the resources and population size they have available to them. But that's kind of as far as my knowledge goes. In school, what I was taught about was the USSR, and it was about Mao's communist China. But it wasn't any of these other socialist countries. So talk to me about socialism more broadly and how it's spreading across the world in perhaps regions that we don't learn about in school, and how that is being influenced by these bigger players like Russia and China.
Yeah, wow, that's honestly a fantastic question. Like it's such a major sort of focal point of the book that like sort of rise, because and I can really only speak to like Central America, because that's where like my studies were the last 2 years, like living down there and stuff. But it really all starts with like Fidel Castro. So Castro's revolution was 1959. The leader who was in the throne of Cuba, who was sitting in the throne of Cuba, before that was this guy Batista, who was an American-backed leader. There are rumors, like people told me in Panama, that in 1959 Batista was starting to sort of like say no to the US government and inch away, but the broader sort of like knowledge of how that like uprising came to be is just that, Cubans led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and all that were just sick of like the Batista leadership and how it was sort of everything catered to the Americans, which, it's a theme that runs through a lot of these like third world nations in Latin America. But Castro comes into play 1959. The Bay of Pigs happens in 1961, which I'm not like extremely well versed in it, but what it really was like a major betrayal of the US government for the sort of revolutionaries in Cuba who wanted to take Cuba back, and take Cuba like out of Castro's hands. So 61 happens, Bay of Pigs, Castro defeats the Cuban revolutionaries who were backed by the CIA, and Castro decides that he's going to partner up with the Soviets, because the Soviets didn't just try to, take him out of his throne using his own people. And plus, if Castro knows that if he wants to survive as a socialist leader, he's got to, sort of partner up with the leaders of that entire ideology, which is, so with the Soviet Union at the time. So obviously, like the whole, Cuban Missile Crisis, like all that stuff, I'm not like extremely well versed, but people know the general sort of like gist of what happened. Like the US and Russia like almost came to like nuclear war. Cuba was like the center of all that because of the nuclear weapons that were supposedly on the Cuban island. Like I said, I really don't know too much, but after that, what it did for a lot of like leaders or future leaders in Central America and Latin America was that they saw that there was somebody standing up to like the US government, and somebody that like they perceived to have won these like huge ideological battles. So this entire like the Cold War and stuff, like you could make the case that it's, it's about business or it's about land or whatever. But it really, like when you boil it down, like it's like an ideological war. You're fighting against an ideology that you don't want to spread. The United States has this thing like the National Security Doctrine. It basically just means that like the US will and should do whatever they can and will to sort of stop the spread of things that are like not of national interest to the United States. And communism is like a huge thing. So the Cold War like intensifies in Central America because of Castro, and because Castro sort of like wins in a lot of these different battles. And then you start seeing, you know, socialist leaders pop up all over South America, specifically, and this is where like my knowledge comes in with the story, but specifically in Nicaragua in the late 1970s with like the Sandinista movement, who I think they're still in power in Nicaragua to this day. This Daniel Ortega, I actually think he might have died recently, but he was inaugurated in like 1985, and all these guys sort of say the same thing. Like Omar Torrijos, the socialist dictator of Panama, late 60s, all of the 70s, Daniel Ortega, and, you know, all the ones in South America, a lot of them, like Hugo Chavez of Venezuela said this too, but a lot of them say that they were really inspired by Castro. So Castro starts this wave of socialism in Latin America that just like catches fire. And it's obviously like a major problem for the US because they don't want that so close to home, you know, especially if the Soviets are using those socialist nations to sort of house these nuclear weapons and these military bases and all the spy activity that sort of generates from those countries being so close to the US. So Noriega, and not so much Omar Torrijos, but Noriega being the chief of intelligence in Panama, becomes like a major ally for the US. So the US basically call Noriega whenever they need information. They say, hey, you know, we're hearing rumors about like a potential socialist uprising in El Salvador. You know, can you tell us about that? Or if you can, like, can you send people there? Or like, in many cases, like, can you call up the people in charge there and ask them directly? Now, that was mostly done with Castro. So the CIA would, in the early days, starting as early as like 1971, according to Noriega, the CIA would call Noriega and they would say, hey, you know, we need information on this, like, revolutionary in Cuba, or we need information on like this CIA asset who was arrested by Castro's men and he's currently in a jail cell in Cuba. Like, can you go there, talk to Castro and negotiate the release, or, you know, get the information that we need? So everything, the waters just become super muddied because of this like sudden spread and because of these ideologies. But Noriega affirms himself as like this like true ally during this time, as like all of this chaos is ensuing with like socialism and all that in Latin America.
What's in it for him, and how is he able to position himself in this way when up until this point we've got all of these different socialist countries backed by even more powerful socialist countries? There's quite a clear divide between America, freedom, capitalism, and this contrasting juxtaposition of socialism, the other side of the Panama Canal. Suddenly we have this key player, Manuel Noriega, that comes in as chief of intelligence. Why, psychologically, is he willing to back the US, who I can imagine, if he's grown up there his whole life, he's probably been indoctrinated to hate, and it's a country that stands fundamentally against his nation's ideology. So what's in it for him, and how is he able to actually possess this much power?
Well, he basically, like, he set, everything was very intentional. He set himself up to be in this exact position. Like, this was, and like, I wasn't able to speak to him. He you know, he died in 2017, but I spoke to like family members and of course his right-hand man, who like the book is based on. But Noriega was like hand selected from his military school in Peru, like as a teenager, by the CIA. So in the 1950s, Noriega's like this gifted student in Chorrillos Military Academy in Lima. And it's there that he meets this guy, Richard Helms, who becomes the director of the CIA in the early 1970s. Like, he was the director of the CIA during like the Watergate scandal. Like, he's like a big name in CIA history and a very important guy. So, you know, him and Noriega go way back. And Noriega quickly becomes like a US asset, like a CIA asset in Central America because of this. Like, they've you know, picked him up at such a young age. Like, I wouldn't necessarily call it indoctrination. I do think like that is, of course, like a, you know, a key player in like all this stuff. But I think Noriega was paid a lot of money in the early days because I know for a fact he worked for the US mapping service, like I'm not even sure what he did, but he worked for the U.S. mapping service, and he was like, I only did it because they paid me 4 times more than what the Panama National Guard were paying me. So he was after money a lot in the early days, and that is like a running theme because, you know, as he sort of rose into the dictatorship and he started getting this like very public criticism, like international criticism for like money laundering and like drug trafficking and stuff. Like money is always sort of a key player here, but as the years progress and as he becomes more important to the nation of Panama, he understands that in order for Panama as like an independent nation to be strong, he needs to strengthen the intelligence ties like all around the world. So what he did very purposefully was, if the CIA or like the newly formed DEA in the 1970s asked him for favors, he would say, yeah, no problem. You need your trash taken out? Like, I'll take it out. And then, you know, when he wasn't dealing with the CIA and DEA, he would get very close with Fidel Castro. And he'd be like, if you need something, I'm your guy. And like Castro would use him for a lot of different things. Like if Castro wanted Cuban spies on the Panama Canal, Noriega would give the Cubans Panamanian passports and be like, welcome in, like, do what you got to do. I'm going to turn a blind eye. Then, you know, as the years progressed and the sort of relationship between Noriega and the CIA and the United States like really intensified and sort of like started reaching its boiling point, Noriega reached out to China, to the CCP, and they were like, and he was like, you know, let's start talking about cutting a deal. So he was very much like, the way it was described to me, they called it feeding the white bear so that it wouldn't eat you. They said, like, you got to feed the CIA and the US government just enough intelligence and do just enough for them so that they don't eat you. And that was the ideology that Carlos, the right-hand man, told me about. Noriega probably instilled that in him. And then Fidel Castro probably instilled that in Noriega. So it's like a huge trickle-down effect, and even making it relevant to sort of the discussion today. Like Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, who currently has like a $50 million bounty on his head, and like there's US warships in Venezuelan waters and all this crazy shit, and the Chinese are like funding Maduro and all this crazy stuff. You know, it's Maduro in many different speeches and conversations has said like that he was directly influenced by him, and Hugo Chavez, the former president, former dictator, were heavily influenced by Omar Torrijos, who was the Panamanian socialist dictator, who was influenced by Castro. So it's all one giant like trickle down effect, like socialism in Latin America.
Yeah. Well, what fascinates me is just thinking about the human element to this and imagining yourself in that situation, moving in those circles. Something like Richard Helms selecting Noriega, and all of these personal interactions, these dark rooms and late night secret conversations. What would that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, it's a question I asked Carlos many times, and a lot of these guys are really tight-lipped, and Noriega specifically, and I interviewed like so many people about this, and you know, I'm sure I'm going to get contested on this fact by many, but everybody sort of said that Noriega died with the majority of his really dark, dirty secrets. You know, he really was like, he was like the guy in Central America for so long. He definitely did some things that the US government like would not like known. You know what I mean? Like things that documentation probably never even existed for. I know about a couple like that with the whole Iran-Contra Affair scandal in the 1980s.
Well, talk to me about that.
I mean, so that was what it really was like a huge public embarrassment for like the US government, specifically, you know, for Ronald Reagan and H.W. Bush, because their guys, Poindexter and Oliver North and Richard Secord and probably a couple other guys, they were sort of acting on interests that were against US Congress. What happened was US Congress voted for a trade embargo with Iran because of like a hostage crisis, and in 1979 the Ayatollahs like overthrew the Shah of Iran, and like it was a whole big deal for the US government. But where it comes into play in this is that the money that the you know, Poindexter and North and all these guys generated from illegal arms sales, like disregarding the embargo, they would use that to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua who were fighting against the Sandinistas, which were the socialist, the socialist group that were like uprising, and they had taken control of Nicaragua. So, the Iran-Contra affair, just that was, we call it like the turning point in sort of this history where Noriega was super helpful, a big ally right up until like 1984, and then Noriega starts acting on his own interests, and he basically starts saying no to the U.S. government, and then the U.S. government and those guys that I mentioned, Poindexter North, all of that, they get publicly embarrassed, they get publicly scolded. There's like that huge trial, the Iran-Contra trial, and Noriega becomes like the scapegoat of that.
Are there any assassination attempts for Noriega once he does become the scapegoat?
Yeah. Oh yeah, there's tons. There's one really, I don't want to say cool, but it's very cinematic. Carlos told me that in like the early 1980s, Noriega was sort of, the waters were becoming testy. He didn't become like the enemy yet. He was still like a friend, but the U.S. government I don't want to say the U.S. government, but somebody put like a bounty out on Noriega's head, $1 million bounty. And Carlos,
how does that actually manifest in reality? How do you see the bounty? Where is it? How is it communicated to different people?
I don't know. That's a good question, because you have like the bounty on Maduro's head right now. Like, who's paying that? Like, where does that come from? Like, those are really good questions. But the way Carlos broke it down for me was, because I said the same thing. I was like, would you really risk your life and like your family's safety for the chance at like $1 million? Like, even if you were super poor. And I already kind of knew the answer to the question, but Carlos like started laughing, and he was like, anyone with a cock and balls and a gun would shoot another man for $1 million. And he was so like straight faced about it. He was like, I would fucking do that for $1 million. I would shoot someone for $1 million. Like, you wouldn't. So, I mean, plenty of assassination attempts. Like with Castro, like by the 80s, there were like hundreds of assassination attempts, like 700 recorded or something crazy. Like, so many, dude. They would like, I guess Castro's guys would like dive for clams and like shellfish and stuff. And there were CIA operations that like poisoned the clams at like the bottom of a seabed, so that like his guys would come down and like pick these shellfish up and then bring them to like the kitchen, hoping that Castro would eat one. Like there's a lot of like really crazy stuff. Like the CIA like really did not want Castro in power, but Castro sort of had like enough understanding of what was going on at like the ground floor of his nation that there's like a really cool saying that Carlos told me, and I'm sure he stole it from someone else, but he said that like during the height of the Cold War, there wasn't a plane that landed in Havana that Castro didn't know about. So no matter where the plane was coming from or who was on it, like Castro sort of like knew who was coming in and out of Cuba. And then of course you have like your clandestine operations where like people are being like airdropped in the middle of the night, or you're taking these boats and coming in or whatever. Like all that stuff absolutely existed, and the drug trade proves that. Like how Castro sort of turned a blind eye and allowed for these like the cocaine trade to like pass through Cuba. Like that's all pretty obvious. But when it came to like intelligence and all that sort of stuff, like he kind of had it locked down. Like there's a reason why the guy died he didn't die that long ago, but there's a reason why the guy did not die of assassination. Is because he's sort of just like, he knew it was coming all the time. So he was always on high alert.
Well, talk to me more about these inner workings of the CIA and foreign intervening or intervention, because I can imagine, maybe not, but from my perspective as a Brit, we can often be told a pretty polished version of history. Now, there's been a complete rebuttal to that in the last few years, where we're taught that we're explicitly only evil, and that's a rabbit hole not to go down. But I can imagine that as an American perhaps listening, people won't know the inner workings of the CIA and how this foreign intervention actually happens. Something like poisoning clams at the bottom of a seabed. Yeah. Talk to me more about that.
I don't know. I mean, I tell those stories because those are like the cool ones that you can research and stuff. But like, I don't know what the inner workings of the CIA are. Like, I don't think we're not supposed to know. Like, if we did know, it just defeats the purpose of like the entire organization. But what I do know is that like during this time in Panama and Central America, it mostly just sort of came down to, obviously it came down to control, but it was a true business. You know, you were buying and selling information,
Hmm.
right? And the same way that the CIA were trying to get like a super strong foothold in Central America, the Soviets were too, you know, and then like Israel has a huge presence in Panama. There's a ton of Israelis that live there. Mossad was very present. Like Carlos was trained by Mossad in the early 1970s. You know, before he really did anything for the CIA or the DEA, like he was trained by them because they, you know, well, he was under Noriega's wing, but like he was invited there to train and learn all those skills and not necessarily become an asset. Like he never really was, but he was somebody that could be called if necessary. So a lot of this stuff, like I don't want to, because like a CIA guy could be listening to us right now and could be like, oh yeah, like this is all fucking bullshit. Like this kid doesn't know what he's talking about, which is very possible. Like I only know what I was told and what I could like read in documents that like I found in Panama. But you know, control, huge part of it, national security doctrine, making sure that all these problems outside of the US don't start to like infect the US and cause more problems there, and all that was like ideological at this time. But then early 1970s rolls around, the drug trade really intensifies from like Colombia, you know, the cartel, Escobar, the Ochoas, all that stuff, like really it starts flaring up. So the problem stops becoming communism and like those ideological spreads, and it starts becoming drugs very quickly.
You've read through a bunch of papers from the DOJ, the DEA. What were some of the most profound takeaways from reading through those actual documents?
The biggest takeaway was, and it was like repeated in just about every letter that I read. I uncovered like hundreds. I say uncovered because it's, you know, it's a fancy word, but there was a man in Panama called Jose Hilario Trujillo. He was a like an Air Force pilot under Noriega, but you know, he basically just became a historian. Like he started hunting down all these files. Like these files like once belonged to Manuel Noriega, like in the 1980s. Noriega kept all these files in like a little binder. And then as he was like extracted during the US invasion of Panama, a lot of them like stayed in his office, were documented, sealed, all that sort of stuff. So I have these documents and I put them in the book, but they all sort of show two things. They show gratitude and favors. So a lot of these letters will be like, thank you so much, Colonel Noriega, for stopping this this shipment of drugs at this exact day and time with like these men. And then the next paragraph will be like, we could not do this without you. Like, thank you for your consistent cooperation with the US government. Like you, like basically like we're in your debt. And that's like the theme running through all these letters. So I don't call this stuff like revelations, but it tells like a fresh narrative, like a new narrative to a story that's just, it's kind of bullshit. The story that people hear is that Noriega was this brutal dictator who needed to be taken out of his regime. Of course, he was not a good guy. There was a lot of bad shit that happened, like on the ground floor of the nation. You know, the poor really were affected the most, but nobody ever talks about the fact that he was put into that position, like very specifically by the CIA and the US government. He was given everything that he needed. As long as he kept saying yes to the favors that the US government, particularly the DEA and CIA, asked of him, he would have stayed in that throne for a very long time. But his ego got too inflated. He started pushing back on the US government and the CIA, and it was only when he started like saying no to their favors that they had asked so many times before for so many years that the letters stopped coming. You know, the gratitude stopped, the favors dwindled down, and then by 1987, 1988, he become like, the US media paints him as like a Pablo Escobar type guy, like this like terrorist essentially to like American safety. And like they're, you know, people aren't wrong about that. Like he wasn't a good guy for a lot of different reasons, but This book sort of, it highlights the framework that the CIA and the US government used, and I presume still uses, to pick a strong man, build them up, use them, extract everything that they can from that nation and the people, and then when everything is said and done, they just discard them only to start it all again.
Well, I want us to speak about that framework because I want to make sure we're representing all sides of the story here.
Of course.
But I do think it's fascinating to delve into some of the less honorable things that occurred during this period. Can you speak to me about some of the sort of most shocking things that were going on at the time?
Well, on both different sides. Yeah, I'll talk about some of the really horrible things that the Noriega regime did. He basically, and I met with a journalist in Panama like 2 weeks ago about this, and I wanted to get like a really balanced sort of story. It's all for like an article, but I don't want to come across as like the gringo who knows more about Panama's history than like a Panamanian. You know what I mean? Like these people, like they lived it. Like most of the reporters like reported on it, and some of them were excommunicated for this stuff. Like, I really have no leg to stand on when it comes to the way they felt about this stuff. So Noriega he basically had like his own SS, like he called them the Dobermans. Like they would roam around the street at nights and they would beat up political opposition and they would burn down the offices of like newspapers and like a bunch of, telltale shit of like a dictatorship. You know what I mean? Like all the checklist is there. Like everything's being ticked off. Like, oh yeah, he's nationalizing, he's appointing his own judges, he's doing whatever, right? When it comes to specific stories, there was a revolutionary called Hugo Spadafora in 1985. He was sort of like a Che Guevara type guy. He traveled around like fighting in different like revolutionary battles, like civil wars, stuff like that. By all means, people say he was like a good man, but he was an opponent of the Noriega regime, and he was a vocal opponent. And one day in 85, maybe it was 86, I always get this year mixed up, but he was abducted by Noriega's PDF, the Panama Defense Forces. His body was like chopped up into like little pieces and like thrown across the Costa Rican border. And people found the body and they were like, clearly this was like the regime that did this. So there are a lot of like, that's like a really big story. This journalist, Richard Coster in Panama, like he's very resourceful source of information for this kind of stuff. He worked for Newsweek, like during the Cold War in Panama and Central America. He just knows everything. But he said that the mutilation and murder of Hugo Spadafora was like the official divorce of the USA and Noriega. And then, and then after that, like things just got worse and worse and worse. And yeah. But overall, I mean, it was just sort of Noriega like extracting the power, sucking it all to the top, and it was the poorest people that really were affected by him, like domestically, which is all painted in the book. Like this image is shown of like how people felt and how they were really affected, and I don't gloss over that by any means because it's so important. But I really want the focus of the book and like the discourse surrounding it to be about the relationship that Noriega had with the United States at the highest possible level, and how it really like it was just like a proxy the whole time. Like Noriega was just acting on the interests of the US, which some people know, but the majority of people like really don't know that. They just put Noriega in the same box as like Pablo Escobar, when in fact he was like a little bit closer to a Fidel Castro than a Pablo Escobar, if that makes sense.
The production of this video is made possible by gear from DFI Rentals. Book your next film equipment instantly at dfirentals.com. So there are these atrocities being committed, but they're also being committed by someone who's ultimately puppeteered by America.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the perfect summary of everything I said. Yeah, exactly. It was just, a tale as old as time. Like just the US wants an American-friendly leader to be in place of a nation that has like a really strong resource for the US government, which in Panama's case is the Panama Canal. And then as the 1970s sort of progress and the drug trade like increases and all that sort of stuff, Panama's banking system, which was sort of new at the time in the 70s becomes like very liberal, and a lot of like drug lords and stuff like that, people like that, begin using Panama's like very liberal banking system as a way to wash money and launder money. People call it like the Switzerland of the Americas, because there's like privacy from the outside, but like once you're in, you know. And it's something right up until the Panama Papers, like, which was 2016, I think, which, yeah, what, like nearly 10 years ago. But right up until then, like, just made right up from drug lords right up to like major corporations, like, just took advantage of this sort of like banking system in Panama. So between the canal and the banking system, like, you know, so much American interest there, so much money there. You know, they of course want to have like a stranglehold over it, like as strong as they can. They want their grip to be as tight as possible.
Well, talk to me more about this drug trade that goes on. And then in 1989, in mid-December, we get the US invasion of Panama. I want us to keep this tied into actual effects on today, and people being able to ground this in a relevance to today.
Yep.
So what goes on with the drug trade, and then eventually what goes on with the invasion of Panama?
Yep. So the drug trades, it really intensifies in the 1980s. A lot of people know, or like have heard of, like Nancy Reagan's The War on Drugs, right? That really begins in like the mid 1980s. And it really does become like a huge problem for the US, because all these drugs are pouring into the United States from Latin America, right?
Where are they going through? Are they going through New Mexico or California or Texas?
The ones I know about, Texas, Louisiana, Florida. But there were so many different trades, like from all over the country. Like, you know, the Johnny Depp movie Blow. Like, have you ever seen that? Oh, it's an awesome movie. Yeah, it's a true story. This guy, like Boston George, from Boston, but he became like a smuggler for Escobar, and I think his first routes were from Colombia to Los Angeles. So there were guys like not every guy, but there were guys going to like all over the country. Like every route was different and like sort of meticulous in a way, but
it's just totally pervasive.
Yeah, exactly. But the really strong ones were to like Texas, Florida, Louisiana, because obviously they're bordering the Gulf, and like easy like sea access, and in a lot of cases like plane access. Like, have you ever seen the movie American Made, like the Tom Cruise?
I don't
movie?
watch movies.
Oh, you don't?
This is the problem.
Man. Well, you should watch American Made. It's a pretty good movie, but it tells the story of this guy Barry Seal, who was like a pilot that was employed by the CIA to do like reconnaissance, like to do recon over like Nicaragua and El Salvador and all these nations that were having these socialist uprisings. And the CIA basically hired these pilots to take pictures and to report those pictures back to the agency so that decisions could be made at like a higher level. That's what a lot of intelligence is. It's just like gathering knowledge from places specifically, and then, you know, pushing it up the chain. And but anyway, these pilots started to take advantage of their like perceived secrecy, and they would while they were taking pictures of these locations, they would also they would fly to Colombia and like load up their plane with coke. They would get paid by the cartel and then fly their planes back to like CIA airports in the US, and like essentially like they would like use their like secret routes that the CIA created for them to do two jobs at once. One, reconnaissance for the CIA, but two, they would like transport drugs. If you get me, this is something that like Carlos wouldn't really talk to me that much about, but it's also like pretty well known. The movie like American Made like really put it on the map, you could say. But yeah, like essentially like the CIA had to make a decision as to whether they would sort of like turn a blind eye, or whether they would like start cracking down on that. So these CIA pilots would transport drugs while also working for the CIA. And then as time progressed, like as the Iran-Contra Affair became like a huge deal in 85, 86, the CIA then like started, you know, turning on those guys and taking care of them, whoever they took care of them. None of this stuff is like really truly documented. Like if they were, those letters are shredded. But the clandestine sort of operations of these drug smugglers, where these routes were sort of taken advantage of because they were protected by the CIA. People try to summarize and they're like, the CIA were like transporting drugs to the US, and this was like all the CIA, like a big like psyop or like whatever. But not that I know like the complete answer. I don't think anybody alive like truly does, but they just took advantage of the situation and made a shitload of money, and then a lot of them were capped.
What do you mean?
Like Barry Seal was like shot in like a hotel room or something like that. Like he was in like the late 80s, or I'm not really sure exactly when it was, but after he made all his millions and and like after he made all his millions, and then the CIA like were publicly embarrassed and US government were publicly embarrassed by the Iran-Contra Affair. Then
what's that?
The Iran-Contra Affair? Oh, I just explained it like earlier with the trade embargo with Iran.
I feel like we need to unpack this for people as uneducated as I.
It is a complex issue, or sorry, a complex story. It's not an issue anymore, but it like basically in the 1970s, communism, like we talked about, socialism spreading. Nicaragua has a socialist uprising in the 1970s, late 1970s. Then in 1979, in Iran, the Ayatollahs overthrow the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran was like an American-friendly like dictator. The Ayatollahs come in, they're not American-friendly. They take back the nation, and they take a bunch of hostages. I think it was like Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, that officially took the hostages. But either way, American hostages are taken. It's a huge crisis, and as time progresses, it results in there being a trade embargo with Iran, so you can't like do trade with them. And US Congress like votes for that. While all of that is happening over here, the Sandinistas come into power in Nicaragua. So there's no American-friendly leaders in Nicaragua, right? Socialism is like taken over. A rebel group rises up called the Contras, and the CIA starts to like fund them, give them, weapons, like training, like all that sort of stuff, so that if and when the Contras overthrow the Sandinistas, the socialists, then the Americans will finally have like an American-friendly government in Nicaragua. In order to fund the Contras, because they didn't want to do it like publicly and like be criticized by US Congress and the media and whatnot, they illegally sold weapons to Iran, and then and the funds that they received from selling those weapons under the trade embargo, which was illegal, they would then use that money to fund the Contras. So everything was like behind closed doors. It was basically just one giant secret operation to like overthrow socialism and communism in this one Central American nation. And Panama being like right there, like not directly next to Nicaragua, but right there in the region, was just like a natural ally. And they like relied upon Noriega to transport those weapons to the Contras, to transport money. In some cases, they tried to like get Panamanians to like train soldiers, like Contra soldiers, and all that sort of stuff. So I hope that explains it, because I feel like I could do my best explaining it, but it really is like, it's such a complex thing that like on the surface level, you're like, yeah, I get it. But as you go down like these layers, it just sort of like, at least I realized that this really was just like at the end of the day, one giant embarrassment for the US government and the CIA, because they tried to be sneaky and they got caught, basically.
Talk to me more about your relationship with Carlos. He's this right-hand man to what many people call a dictator, and someone who has committed certain atrocities. What was it like being on the ground with him and learning lessons from him, hearing these stories, being there with him? Talk to me more about that.
Yeah, it was nuts, dude. I spent a lot of time with him over the course of 2 years, like several months at least, like 4 months, 5 months. And I lived with him. I met his entire family, all of his children, ex-wives, like things like that. And he really he was very like instinctual kind of guy. Like he had a lot of machismo, and like he very much like he he shot from the hip, right? So he didn't, at least to me, like he didn't think about why he was doing certain things like all too much. He just sort of like truly felt it in his gut and like based every action off his own instincts. Now that being said, he was incredibly sharp. So he, being like a triple agent in his day, like he learned a lot about like human psychology and mostly like physical psychology. So let's say like you and I, like you're Carlos and I'm sitting opposite you with my like little voice recorder, like taking your story down. If I don't look him in the eye or if like, if I stutter or if I like ask him a question that and I'm like too nervy about it, like he picks up on it instantly and he takes advantage of everything. So I had to have like a lot of conviction when speaking with him. So if I wanted to ask him something, like I had to not only sort of like vocalize that in the correct way, but also like really show it with my body. And it was like a major learning lesson for me. Like I never really was like that in the past. Like most writers are pretty like, we're like, we isolate ourselves and we're like introverts and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But when you're sitting with a guy who like has done all these crazy things, like you can't be like an introvert. You can't like really show any signs of weakness, even if both of you know exactly what the power dynamics are in the conversation. Like you just gotta like, you gotta have conviction in everything that you do, because if you don't, then no one's gonna take you seriously. And if you're asking a guy like about, you know, like overthrowing leaders, and if you're asking a guy about like going on secret missions for the DEA and CIA and all this sort of stuff, like if he doesn't feel like you really want to know that stuff for the right reasons, like he picks up on it like that. So
Yeah.
that was like a big thing that I took out of this. It's just like, you know, maybe not, maybe don't be exactly like Carlos in the way that he lived his life, but he certainly had conviction. He shot from the hip. Like he knew what he wanted to do in every single scenario, and he just like acted upon pure instinct, for better or for worse.
Well, talk to me more about how this has affected your outlook on the human condition in terms of seeing one of these players that's experienced all of these extremely high stakes events. And we often think that we're experiencing situations where we're under pressure and the stakes are high, but nothing compares to some of these experiences that he's had. So I can imagine his outlook on life must be very different after the experiences that he's had. What were some of the biggest takeaways for you in terms of the human condition and how experiencing these things affects our perception of the world?
Yeah. I think, I mean, dude, I was like a blank slate going into this whole thing, very like immature now looking back on it. And I think what I took from all this and what I sort of learned was that like loyalty, when you're dealing with like high risk situations and where like life or death is like really like a thing. I'm not saying that it was like that for me, even though there were some sort of like iffy sort of moments. Nothing like crazy, but like loyalty is so important, and like you have to show loyalty through action, which is something that Carlos did just like instinctually. Like I said, like if he was loyal to you, like he really would take like a bullet for so many people. So it's like a one strike policy. You have one chance, and like you got to show it. You got to like take your opportunities. So I think like when it comes to the human condition and relationships, and specifically me connecting with an 80-year-old man from a country that I don't speak the language and was the right-hand man of like a dictator that many call brutal. Like I just had to find the parts of myself that I could bridge to the parts of himself, and just like anchored myself in those moments. So like I really believe in like the preservation of like art and culture in like in like your own independent nation. So like Ireland, I love the fact that people like want to speak Irish and like care about like Irish artists and whatnot. The same way that I care about that, Carlos really cared about like Panama and the preservation of Panamanian culture. And I just think that, I don't know, it all really at the end of the day boils down to like just be loyal to what you believe in. It also comes back to like conviction. You know, you can make the right or wrong decision based on like your own beliefs, but if you're convicted, you know, you're going to go through with it. So yeah, I hope that like is a good explanation of like how I felt, because loyalty, conviction, there's like a like a merger there, but that was just like after being with Carlos, I was like, wow, like I really truly understand like how these people sort of weathered the storm of like all of this crazy shit, and they really just did it because they like trusted each other, for better or for worse. You know?
Well, without asking you to extrapolate too much here, are there any things you can infer on the power dynamics today and specifically these interpersonal relationships? What's going on the ground when Donald Trump goes for a meeting with Putin or Xi Jinping or other foreign leaders? What are the dynamics at play there? What's going on inside their head when they're shaking hands and they're smiling for the cameras compared to what goes on once they're off the mainstream media and they're actually making deals? Are there any things you learn from these guys?
Kinda, yeah. I mean, when speaking about anything like contemporary, like anything in present day with like Trump or whatever, like I know nothing. Anything that I would say would just be like a guess. But back in the day, and I know this to be true, but back in the day when Noriega and the sort of the dictatorship, like the regime, even Omar Torrijos, when they would invite the members of like the American government down to Panama, they would have like a list, like a well-researched list of the things that they liked, that they didn't like, what they did in their spare time, like what kind of people they were. Specifically, like if, let's say, like a bunch of people are coming down from the US to have a meeting with Omar Torrijos and Noriega over like the future of the Panama Canal, like decisions that they were going to make that would affect Panamanian society, that, you know, the leader would need to sort of like be in on. Noriega and Torrijos would, you know, find out exactly who were coming down, and they would go so deep as to like embed spies like in the US and be like, okay, find out like, does this guy like to cheat on his wife? Like if he does, we'll have a bunch of prostitutes ready for him here in Panama. And then like if someone else was like a huge book nerd and like really truly believed in like, you know, the Republican or Democrat cause, like whatever it was at the time, they would make sure that when that person came down, that they would set them up with a Panamanian who like was really charismatic about the same things that they believed in. So everything was manipulation. Everything was super well researched. Intelligence was just like the strength of like everything that they did. So that's why Noriega like lasted as long as he did, because he just like, he put so much emphasis on intelligence and like just knowing everything about like his enemies or his allies, like however he perceived them.
We've glossed over it or skirted around the edges of it, and I want to make sure you get the chance to actually speak about this properly. This book that you've got, The Right-Hand Man, what do you actually want to achieve from it? What are the key takeaways here from this conversation and from the book?
Yeah, the major takeaway, the major sort of motivation with the book is to present a new narrative to the story that people have been told for decades. Specifically when it comes to Panama, you know, I think the Panamanian people deserve to have like their story told as opposed to the story sort of told by the US government, and how that, because when you do that, you trickle like those like missing facts or like the sort of the manipulated narrative like trickles down to the ground floor and to society in Panama, and it washes away a little bit of national identity. So for the Panamanian people, I really would like for this to be considered like a very well researched like history book, one that provides like a new narrative. From a broader stance, one that I hope lasts like longer than like whatever little like burst of attention comes from this like right away, is that this book really is like a framework of how and why these foreign strongmen are picked, how and why they're built up, how and why they're used, and like everything is extracted from that nation, and then how and why they are discarded. Because this isn't just, even though the story like only covers Noriega and like Central America, the same thing has happened like all over the world. I'm no expert on all of the different sort of like CIA-backed coups, but there's like 1953 in Iran, there's like Saddam Hussein, there's like Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and a lot of these people come into place and they're like brutal to their nation, but as long as they're acting on American interests, you know, it's whatever to the US, you know what I mean? Like, this guy's doing what I say, so let's keep him in power and let's do what we can. And yeah, so that's sort of like the purpose of the whole thing.
I don't want to get you to guess about the major conspiracy theories out there like other podcasts will do.
Yeah.
But I do find it interesting looking at you and the research you've done and thinking about your attitude towards conspiracy theories. I mean, talk to me about how that's shifted since doing this huge body of work. Are you now more open to conspiracy theories, all of the things of a deeper state and government pulling other levers? Because the whole mission that you've outlined with this book, or one of the missions, is to expose how big, strong men can turn a blind eye if it's convenient for them. I mean, surely you can't just leave it there. There must be other stuff going on and other conspiracy theories that are coming to the surface that maybe do hold weight. Am I wrong?
I guess. I mean, I don't wear a tinfoil hat and say the aliens built the pyramids, you know,
Yeah.
but
Although that is true.
yeah, dude, there's so many different conspiracies out there. Like, everything is a conspiracy these days. Like, you go on Twitter, like every fucking third tweet is like some conspiracy. I'd say like there's always merit to a conspiracy. I think like how many times have you, or like, well, maybe not how many times like you've heard this, but you know, you'll hear like people talking about conspiracies like 1 decade, and then 3 decades later, the CIA will like declassify documents and be like, you guys were right the whole time. You know what I mean? Like I would imagine that there's always a little bit of merit to a conspiracy, but I think it's a waste of time bickering back and forth about it. I think like in many ways it's probably what the intended outcome was, like, of whoever created that conspiracy, is to like deter sort of people from whatever the actual truth is. But that being said, like all the major conspiracies that people chat about online, like, do I think there's like documentation that exists that like everyday citizens will be able to like access? Like, absolutely not. Like, we don't, you know, we're not able to get our hands on the Epstein files or, you know, whatever. You know what I mean? Like, that's not going to happen for us. Like, the information that we receive is given to us. And obviously that births more conspiracies. People are like, why is this information given to us? Like, why this specific story? Like, why this specific person? You should be asking those questions. Like, I asked those questions with the book. The only difference is that like I'm more of a historian digging up the truth. You know what I mean? Like, I got to dig a lot of little plots, but like I'll find it eventually. If you have conspiracies about something that's going on currently, I'm not going to say it's a waste of time, but I think it's going to be extremely difficult to like find the answer, because like even if you do find the answer, like the CIA or whoever it is aren't going to give you a pat on the back being like, like, well done. You know what I mean? Like, if you find the answer, chances are you're going to find a bullet if it's like a really big conspiracy. So I don't know. I feel indifferent about it.
Well, do you think there is that power and the infrastructure available to plot out certain narratives and uphold them today in the information age, with mobile phones and people seemingly having more access to things than ever? Is there even the potential for a controlled narrative when a story comes out, or would it just leak out due to lack of organization or whatever else?
Well, that's the thing. Like, you let's say, like, you know, we have a story, it's like on the news 24/7, like everybody's talking about it, and then like a leak happens, right? I think the first question you got to ask yourself is like, who leaked it and why? Like, why would this be considered a leak? Like, why this information? I sound like so annoying saying it probably, but like, just like, why and how are the two most important questions when addressing a conspiracy. You just like, if you can answer why and how, like, you're going to be so close to the answer, but nobody's going to give you a pat on the back if you do find the answer. You know what I mean? So it's like,
it's analyzing the incentives at play for people.
Exactly. Yeah. It all comes down to like motivation. So like, why and how. It's all about motivation. You know what I mean? It's like, because things don't just happen, you know, out of the blue. There's always a reason for everything. Like every single little chess move that like a government makes on the, you know, on like the global chessboard with like foreign policy and, you know, global affairs. Like, it's all so intentional. Like, nothing is like an accident. And if a conspiracy arises from a decision, then it's going to be hard to find that proof, especially as like an everyday, like, you're not going to find the proof on Twitter. basically.
Cillian, thanks so much for coming on the show. Where can people find more of your work and get access to the book?
My Instagram is dunne.cillian, so dunne.cillian, and then my website is therighthandmanbook.com.
And head on over to Substack, where Cillian's going to answer your questions.